All right, welcome ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wes Rist. I'm the Deputy Executive Director here at the American Society of International Law. I normally stand up and do the welcome and then turn things over to our moderator, but I'm wearing two hats today, so I'll do the official society welcome and then I'll do the moderator's portion as well. For those of you who don't know, ASIL is a 114-year-old professional membership association. We were founded by the sitting Secretary of State for Teddy Roosevelt, who looked around and said, we need some people who know something about international law. And for the first 30-odd years of our existence, we actually served as a de facto advisory group to the U.S. government on international law. However, post-World War II, we took on a much more independent role, and since then have served as a convener on topics of international law and policy. We don't take official policy positions outside of a very select group of times where our members advocate or sponsor us to do so. For example, the last time we did it was when the torture memo came out and we made a very strong statement about torture is against international law. And the time before that was when we withdrew from the International Court of Justice over the Nicaragua case. And we said, we kind of think we should be part of the ICJ. That's an important thing. But that has created an opportunity for the society to serve as a convener on issues of international law and to promote our mission, which is to promote peace and justice through international relations and the rule of law. Today's topic is a perfect example of that kind of overlap of specific issues, and we're excited to have a wonderful panel together to talk about this. I will mention that this is part of our signature topic series, which has been looking at the role of international law in atrocity prevention and accountability over the last 2 years. It'll be wrapping up with a very high-profile panel at the annual meeting, at which we'll have quite a few folks from the UN and civil society who are coming to talk specifically about a proposal that has been put forward by international lawyers that is trying to limit the option of veto power of the Security Council in cases of mass atrocities. 3 years ago, we all kind of sat around the table and thought, boy, this will never gain any traction. This year, Adama Dieng is coming down from the UN to talk about whether or not this is a feasible option. So that shows how quickly something can change as a community starts to decide that it's worth looking into. We've got a great discussion lined up for us today. We're talking specifically about the potential gaps and overlap between the very, very recent Global Fragility Act that was passed as part of last year's spending agreement and the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act, which was passed a little over a year ago on its own as a standalone piece of legislation and has been working on implementation. I'm going to do a brief run through of who we've got on our panel here, but you have the bios of everyone in front of you, and I'd rather keep our time for the discussion instead. So to my immediate right is Suzanna Campbell. She's a professor at AU School of International Services. She's had extensive experience working on a lot of these issues related to fragility issues, and specifically in terms of reporting and examining what the role for the actors on the ground and how we monitor and how we evaluate and how we learn from all of these things, which should be a great and interesting perspective. Next to her, we have Nicole Withersteen, who just finished a long time at USAID, has an original part of her career there and is now at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're very pleased to have her with us. She's got a great insider's perspective coming out of USAID, but then also has a little bit more freedom to speak about her perspectives on this now that she's at the Holocaust Museum. Next to her, we have Bridget Moy, who has been the U.S. Executive Director of Peace Direct, which I always get tongue twisted on. She also has been in the peacebuilding community for quite some time, has worked in country and around the world on a lot of different issues, served for 2 years at USAID, I believe, as a fellow as well. And has been involved in providing input and advice to the policy community on these things. So we're excited to have her. And then at the very end is Shukriya Delawar, who is the head of, I forget what the actual thing at FCNL is.
It's just people.
No, Prevention of Violent Conflict. That's the office, the Prevention of Violent Conflict at FCNL. And she's also the head of PPWG, the Prevention and Protection Working Group, which most of us are part of and work on and engage with. It's how I know her as well. She's been very instrumental in reviewing the implementation of the Elie Wiesel Act, working with the team that's been behind the Global Fragility Act and getting that in. And she's got significant engagement with the Hill on policy issues and the executive branch on implementation of those policy issues over the last several decades. And we're very thrilled to have her. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. We greatly appreciate you sharing your insights. And I will kind of lay things out with an overview of where we start from. So the Global Fragility Act tasks the U.S. State Department with creating a strategy-based approach in conjunction with other agencies like USAID and the Department of Defense to identify countries where direct engagement by the U.S. foreign policy and development actors could reduce the risk of violence and prevent the formation of so-called fragile states. This approach has been lauded by many in the civil society community, and in fact, many in the civil society community contributed directly to the formation of the legislation, and it had strong input on its own language and some of the principles that are included in that. But it will also have a significant overlap with efforts already underway to try and manage or prevent or mitigate ongoing mass atrocity activities in specific countries. Obviously, often many of the countries that are dealing with fragility have heightened risk factors for a mass atrocity event of some kind or another. And so it's an understandable overlap. No one in the community that was working on this didn't expect this to be a thing. But we want to discuss a little bit about the risks that might be present and how we manage some of those risks in that overlap. And is there an opportunity for kind of leveraging these two activities and these two policy initiatives to greater heights cumulatively? Or are we in a situation where there might be some competition between the folks who are responsible for putting this together? Nicole, I'm actually going to start with you. You've spent a lot of time on the implementation side of this, inside of government, working on this. In those roles, have you seen tension between the goals of promoting stability of a host nation and preventing or mitigating mass atrocity events? And how do you manage that tension?
I think it's a good place to start. First off, thank you for inviting me to talk. And thanks to everybody who's coming and interested in this on an evening, cold, wet evening. So glad to have some fans of this issue. Yeah, I think that there's definitely going to be some tension and some competition. The Global Fragility Act is starting out in a better place because it has authorized funds. People pay attention inside the U.S. government when there's already funds allocated, and they're not trying to take what I saw consistently, and Bridget saw as well during her time in aid, trying to find money in other places and other pots to program on atrocity prevention, which was a fairly new initiative that they maybe also were trying to learn what it meant. So when you have a mandated strategy, you have authorized money, you already are coming to the table as a bigger and louder player, right? The second thing is that what I have seen for 12 years inside USAID, most of that spent in 7 different countries, is that since 9/11, stability is framed in a countering violent extremism platform, and that it's, I worked for a part of USAID for most of the time that I was at AID, Office of Transition Initiatives, that was initially stood up after the Bosnian War because there wasn't this piece of tool inside USAID to deal with after humanitarian operations and development. Where's that part that works on political transitions in that fuzzy area where you're trying to tip the scale in the positive direction, right? So they had these tools, and then those kind of got superseded or overwhelmed with the focus of the US government to counter violent extremism with development tools and stabilization tools. So, when I look at fragility, and it's mentioned in the act, obviously, both preventing violence, but also preventing violent extremism, I'm worried that we're still in the frame where countering violent extremism is the dominant narrative, the dominant paradigm. And atrocity prevention has always, even though, in US government, it's a fairly new initiative, it has been around for at least over 6 or 7 years, and it has struggled to rise up and get the amount of attention. It's also, and I think we're probably going to touch on this later, there's a very distinctive difference between trying to understand what would drive mass killing, deliberate mass killing of civilians, and what drives fragility, and maybe conflict, or maybe just economic fragility, or just not a pleasant place to live fragility. So those are very different things, but I'll just stop there because it just, to answer your question simply is, yeah, I see some competition. I got some more gaps that I want to dig into, but I'll stop.
Absolutely. That actually leads nicely to, Bridget, let me kind of ping you with, do you see the fact that we now have two distinct legislative mandates, that Congress has actually stepped in, taken on a role, for all that the civil society community has been advocating for Congress to take a greater role, does creating a formalized structure put those executive officer or executive officials in an untenuous situation where they're competing with two masters, or they're struggling to manage that kind of relationship? Is that feasible? Can it be done? Is it does that create less will on the part of the people on the ground to actually try and engage with this? Are we actually hurting our people who are our best representatives on this issue?
Yeah, well, and I echo the thanks of having the conversation, because I think these are the issues that we're going to be grappling with as the GFA moves towards the implementation, and now the LE Cell is already kind of rolling with some implementation. So Nicole definitely pointed out the tensions and the competition that happens, and she knows very well the number of mandates that come down on particularly USAID and other staff who are doing actual programming and trying to sort of meet all these requirements that have been laid on them. So that certainly is an issue. But I think that for us, as an advocate, so first of all, I'm not an international lawyer, and I don't work inside US government.
I'm not a lawyer either.
I'm an advocate. So, and we've been advocating on trying to lift the profile of both atrocity prevention as well as the broader set of conflict issues in a more comprehensive way for a long time. So the fact that Congress has now passed two bills is really important. It demonstrates a level of engagement and understanding from policymakers in Congress that these are priority issues, that we can't keep continuing the same old approach to hitting every conflict problem with a hammer, which is what we tend to do because we have so much resources and capacity on the military side.
We spent so much designing those hammers.
Exactly. And guess what? The military has a lot of different kinds of hammers. And they're okay with that. And they manage to figure out how to use a lot of them in different ways. And so I think we need to think about the civilian side needing a lot of different tools. And a lot of different laws can be helpful. So I think the trick is, how do we mesh these all into something that looks more comprehensively and fits together as opposed to competing. But the fact that you have more legislation, more funding being authorized is really important. I see those as really important advances.
Okay. Shukriya, let me jump to you real quick. The fact that we now have two branches of government that have responsibility for oversight on this, both the executive and the legislative, how do we manage that relationship? Obviously, sometimes compared to others, the legislative and the executive may get along better than not. On some issues, there may be far more bipartisan support. I was just on the Hill earlier today for a panel discussion around the Burma Human Rights and Freedom Act, which was fantastic. Both Senator Young and Senator Cardin showed up and gave remarks very clearly in line with each other, very clearly both committed to advancing that goal. That's fantastic. But sometimes, Congress is divided amongst itself between a majority and minority, and then we also have Congress competing with the executive on that. How do you manage that relationship? How do you manage that so that the line officer equivalent, the civil service employee on the ground, is not catching the flack of the political fallout between the two on these competing potentially oversights?
Sure, that's a great question. So I've been fortunate to actually work on the implementation of the LE Act for the last year. So I have this insider perspective on how to, make sure that the champion offices are actually doing the oversight, and then the implementation is happening from the interagency. There's obviously tensions because politics get involved. So if we take the case of Kashmir right now is high on the list of atrocity prevention. Well, India is an ally. Trump was just on the ground, and this conversation wasn't even brought up. What's happening with Kashmir and removing their rights through India. So the way we handle it is we'll make sure we give in assessments to the Hill that these are issues of concern for atrocity prevention community. And then we follow up with the same assessments with the interagency, closed door Chatham House rules and have really candid conversations. And I think that's where you can start to build a bridge between both branches and see where there is mutual interest to do something on a particular conflict. But I think without advocates and lobbyists concerned on these issues, it almost always will go nowhere. So I think the third piece of getting anything done really is the community itself.
As we talk about getting something done, Suzanna, I wanted to turn to you. You've had two different pieces that have come out recently that are calling into question, or maybe that's terming it a little too harshly, that are raising awareness around the evaluation and reporting requirements of the Global Fragility Act. And specifically, what does this look like on the ground? How do we manage this from a responsible kind of make sure that we're not allowing, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, literally tens of billions of dollars disappearing into the ether? But you're positing that there's also a need for some kind of flexibility, some kind of responsiveness that can be permitted. How do you balance that? How do you, let me start predecessor of what drives you to come to that conclusion, and then how do we balance that?
So first, thank you. This is an awesome path-breaking crowd here, so I'm pleased to be here. And I think this is a really important topic, and I think that, look, I've been researching the behavior, accountability, and boring kind of bureaucratic stuff for about 20 years of international institutions. And one thing that becomes very clear is that what it takes to enable and support performance and success at the country level is often very different and exactly juxtaposed to what we think it takes at the headquarters level, right? And so there are two different, in my last book called Global Governance and Local Peace, I found that there are kind of two different things that you need for performance and success of international peacebuilding institutions. One is you need local accountability. You need and this is very much what, of course, Peace Direct works on. You need not to just kind of consult and extract information from the stakeholders in the country in which you're intervening. You need to actually listen to them, engage them in your work, and give them the authority to help determine what you do, how it's done, and to judge whether it's effective or not. And that's the conceptualization of accountability. None of these organizations, no organization is set up to do that because these are disenfranchised populations, often in their own country. So no one, they are not the kind of boss, the accountability boss of anyone. And yet performance relies on giving them authority that they don't have, right? When Congress, and when we look at the GFA and when we look at what it's trying to do, one of the most crucial things that it's trying to do is to actually shift the bar and shift the focus. So the other thing that I found in my book really matters is what I call formal accountability. And in the book, it's formal accountability for peace building, but it's really formal accountability for whatever thing kind of policy agenda you're pushing. And the way to think about this is, a lawyer looks at a context and sees law, right? A doctor sees medical problems. A peace building organization looks at conflict dynamics. A development organization looks at, health and education. And if you want to shift the bar and the focus of the existing US government architecture, whether it's aid, whether it's DOD, whether it's state, then you actually need to shift its prioritization and shift what it believes it's supposed to be doing. That matters just as much. But too much focus on this kind of top-down accountability, on really focusing on what DC wants and what DC needs to hear, can actually undermine the ability of anybody in the country office to create local accountability. Because if you're spending all your time reporting on this one indicator established in DC, which may not be relevant to the context anymore and may not be localized in any way, then you're going to see meeting that one indicator. I built 10 schools. Well, where are they? Who's in them? What type of education have they actually provided? And so the trick is to actually take the meaning and the content of the Global Fragility Act and put that into practice. It's all there, but the risk is that if you focus on it just being about reporting, then you've lost the game.
So, go ahead, Shakri.
I just want to add to my esteemed colleagues' comments. I mean, if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan specifically from the atrocity prevention lens or peace building lens, I mean, it's like post 9/11, right? So we went in, a lot of money, it was for CT, counterterrorism. And then nearly 2 decades later, so many lessons learned. And then this is, I think, what helped pass Global Fragility Act, because it's really a response to what could we have used in soft power mechanism to actually, help these states where we went in with so much hard power and a lot of money that was unaccounted for, that we ended up not really reaching our objectives in either country.
So Bridget, there's an ongoing effort at USAID to potentially address some of this through a reorganization, through looking at how it might engage on this. Is this a promising thing? Like, reorg is a huge deal inside of the US government, and you and I and a bunch of others have been to meetings where they're just talking about the bureaucratic steps that have to be gone through for all of this. From an outsider's perspective, looking at this, do you see this as a positive thing, this attempt at reorg? And Nicole, I'll give you the right of first rebuttal on.
Well, I don't think reorganization is going to solve everything, that's for sure. But I think that there's a nexus of things happening that presents either an opportunity or a big mess. So,
very, very stark choices we have.
well, there's probably some room in between, but you do have a major reorganization at USAID. It's been in the process for a couple of years, and it'll take a while to actually become formalized, but there will be a new bureau for conflict prevention and stabilization. That is progress in terms of lifting the agenda of conflict within USAID. The problem is that in the reorganization, some really key parts of the organization that deal with the roots of conflict, things like governance, democracy, rights. So the whole part of USAID that was DRG, democracy, rights, and governance, is kind of been split apart and pushed in different places in the organization. And so you have the potential for, again, silos being created that are not actually looking at conflict dynamics in a comprehensive, systemic way that's going to help you prevent violence and reduce the risks of fragility and atrocities and other issues. So the reorganization in itself has these complications. Then you have the Global Fragility Act coming in. So at a briefing not long ago that some folks were at from the new heads of the soon-to-be bureau, they said, frankly, everyone's scurrying around trying to figure out how to implement interagency, implement the GFA. How are we going to report to Congress on this? What are we going to do? But let me tell you, there are plenty of people who just want to figure out how do we check the boxes and say, okay, well, we'll say that this pot of money doing this in this country matches the GFA, or we'll say that this country strategy that we were already coming up with anyway fits those markers. So, and there are others in the system who are saying no, and the heads of that bureau were saying they're ones championing that they really want to make change, and they really do. People inside the system, as Nicole can tell you, it is not satisfying inside the system either. I mean, the aid flows and the way the bureaucracy is set up don't help you do the job you think you went there to do. So everybody, I think, has an opportunity to really think about how does the GFA, along with the USAID reorg, and along with some other things that relate to things like local accountability. So there's a whole program in USAID called Local Works. Peace Directs has been part of the research that's really about how do you create more locally led processes and programming so that you do have local ownership and local agency and local design. And part of the GFA that we worked really hard on as a community was to get language in there that requires consultation and engagement with civil society, including local civil society. So part of what Peace Direct will be tracking and trying to encourage in the implementation process is that piece of the GFA really gets implemented effectively, can be a support to this new bureau that's being stood up, can help USAID integrate lessons from local works, can bring back some of that relevance of democracy and rights and governance that may be getting lost in the reshuffling. One of the things I'll just say, because Peace Direct works with local partners, peacebuilding partners, and they will tell you they don't care what you call this violence that they're experiencing. They want it. They want to be able to fix it, and they want ownership, and they want to be heard. So I think the more that all these efforts can help lift up that principle, the more effective they'll all be.
So that leads us quite nicely to local actors. But before I jump right to that, Nicole, first, your thoughts on the reorg if you have any, or feel free to expand. But also, I'd love if you could give us a sense of like, what's it like for the FSO or the USAID employee on the ground? I know I talk to a lot of students, and they have this sense that there's 30 people in a mission or an embassy or something like that, all dedicated and focused and just doing this, and getting in jeeps and driving around and visiting with people. And so give us a sense of like, what's the actual reality on the ground from your in-country experience? How does this play out by the U.S. government employees who are in country?
Okay, so three things right there, and to talk about. One, I wanted, before I forget it, is to pick up on something that Suzanna said, because it was in my general recommendations, is that unless there is a true priority shift and full alignment by the U.S. government, aid is but one tool. It's actually the smallest resource tool. So when you look at like a DoD budget, or you look at states' political priorities, whether it be trade or all these other things in a given country or region, aid is but one tool. The GFA talks about DoD. We have seen, and I've seen firsthand, sitting in the Atrocity Prevention Board for 5 years, DoD comes to the table, but they sort of are like, we're just going to sit and listen to what you guys are going to do. So I think unless there's a realignment of priorities, resources, and very simply put, and I've heard people start to talk about this, if we're going to focus on fragility on these 5 countries, we better review our arms sales to those countries. We better review our trade posture to those countries, and our economic sanctions. Like, it better be a comprehensive, truly comprehensive. And I think that spirit of that in the act is there, but it never goes that way. Rarely does it go that way inside. On USAID's reorg, I have a lot of issues that Bridget touched on about the breaking up of the democracy, rights, and governance and spreading it around, when that's been an under-resourced area inside USAID for years. And now the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance is its own bureau. OTI is effectively, with CMM subsumed, it's this Bureau of Conflict Stabilization. And these well-resourced branches are now further empowered, and you can still make that a structure for good if you have coordinators. The reason why gender finally got institutionalized in USAID is because multiple administrations kept a gender advisor looking at the entire big beast of aid and enforcing it in and monitoring all these different bureaus. So they weren't these little mini kingdoms or queendoms. And so if you want to have fragility be a paradigm shift, as people are talking about, and as we struggled and frankly we failed, to have atrocity prevention be infused in how we deliver humanitarian assistance, how we do agriculture, how we do health worker outreach, who are some of the frontline workers for USAID out there and can see indicators of atrocity risk. You need to have somebody looking at the entire structure and making sure that it's infused. So there's opportunity in the reorg, but I worry about this coordinating, overseer level that's not there in the reorg. And then, from the ground level, like there's definitely 30 or more people in Washington at aid. And then there's usually like 2 to 3 foreign service officers in a country that has like a $35 million like democracy and CBE and this massive budget. And I worked in 7 different countries for USAID and country teams. And frankly, it was the foreign service nationals who were the corps and the AORs, this assistance officers, who were really and the continuity, who were there for 5, 6, 7 years. Foreign service officers will roll in between 2 and 4 years. So you lose that institutional memory. And so there's that. There's the retraction of U.S. officials to not get out in the Jeep and roll around and get outside the walls or get outside the capital cities. And if you're going to talk about fragility indicators or atrocity risk indicators and all the things that I think this act hopes to push, those things are not in your computer, they're not inside the embassy, and they're not in how you report on these requirements. But I would say one lesson, when every administration comes in and they want to make USAID do better, they bring different initiatives. And people who've been in USAID for years and years will say, it's going to die if it doesn't have any money. Like, don't even talk to us. And so the people in the field will kind of ride that out. They'll see, like, is there money? Okay, I have to report for the next 2 years on this. And then something's going to change, or Congress won't ask us for the report, or something will be subsumed. And, you know, and I worry about atrocity prevention being subsumed into that reporting and saying, oh, we're checking that box. But money, the lesson is that money can solidify an initiative, but you need to have people who are solely focused on that frame, or the indicators of fragility and atrocity prevention, who are looking at the entire structure and trying to get it down to the ground level and get it down to the USAID officers in the field.
So Suzanna, let me actually jump to you on that, because Nicole, you mentioned, you know, these local officers who you're working with and who USG employees work with. One of the things that we've heard repeatedly is that most of the time, the US government funding structures can be incredibly difficult for local civil society actors to engage with, to find some way to participate in and to pull it together. Is there a way to bring US government's behemoth, you know, federal acquisition rules kind of approach into this flexible model? I think actually I just saw a report from Peace Direct that got sent around that I printed out and haven't read yet, but it's on my stack that keeps getting taller of things to read about flexible spending and flexible, you know, funding and how we address that. And still, like, understanding the impetus that Congress is going to have to make sure that money is being spent appropriately, and that somewhere there's got to be some kind of spreadsheet or budget that can be reported back on that says, yes, this money was eventually, in whatever format, spent to serve this purpose. Is that a pipe dream? Like, are we, you know, is the FAR just too big to think that that's actually a possibility, or how do we do that? Recognizing that may be an impossible question.
Well, I think I'm going, you know, my new book compares across many different kinds of donors. So I have not only the US government as a model, but kind of thinking about different ones. But I want to say something first, which is buy local. And in the way I talk about it, I don't just mean kind of community members, right? So if we're thinking about any kind of aid, the main interlocutor is the host government in the state. Even though most of USAID's programming goes around, the one with the authority is the host government in the state. And that influences everything that is done. And so you need to think and do the difficult work about getting beyond the host government and realizing in a hugely politicized environment, you have to do the difficult work of figuring out different perspectives and engaging with different stakeholders at all levels of society. So I think that, is it a pipe dream to actually think that you can alter the way that the US government changes money? The US government actually engages with local stakeholders at whatever level. I'm going to take the US government model, which is a procurement contract-based model, which is more similar to the UK and less similar from Switzerland, Belgium, Japan, many others, right? So if you take this model seriously and you say, we want to use this model to actually engage not just our kind of standard development agencies based out of DC, but actually to incentivize them to collaborate with other stakeholders and maybe possibly get some money to local stakeholders. By the way, I think OTI is the one who has some real lessons learned on this, of course. Then what you need to do is you need to focus less on spending more money and more on accompaniment.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And I want to kind of challenge an assertion that was hidden in your question, which is that the current way of thinking about accountability, in fact, focuses on accountability for doing what Congress wants you to do. The current way focuses on line item spending. I said I was going to build 4 houses. Did I build 4 houses? That is accountability, right? Not, I said I was going to improve education, right? I said I was going to ensure that the children who did not have prior access to education have it now. And not only is that education there, but it's also a curriculum which addresses some of the divides in the conflict. That is an outcome. That's an education-based outcome that will actually affect conflict dynamics.
which could be schools, but could also be traveling teachers or
Right.
fill in the blank.
Right, but that is not easily assessed through aggregated indicators and through just monitoring how much is spent. So you can be accountable, but you have to ask what you're accountable for. And the basic frameworks for accountability are based on the assumption that you know what you're doing at the outset and all you have to do is implement it, right? That is not the world we're living in. But that requires that implementing partners also admit, hey, we may need to figure some things out, right? We may not really understand this. So it challenges the kind of expertise that everybody's purporting to have in this game, right? So if we take this basic model and we say, okay, what happens? Then you say, we need to radically increase the staff that we have at the country level. Because if what we need to do is work with stakeholders, is actually accompany, is help them to problems, and by accompany, I mean not just focused on compliance, but actually focus on helping them to problem solve, addressing issues that come up, being open about failure, and thus enabling success. If you want to do that, then you need people, right? And maybe you need more USAID people and not just subcontractors, right? Because once you contract, if you're trying to instill a kind of certain set of skills in your organization, you contract those out. You're not training the organization that you're contracting out to. They're not part of your organizational culture. Right? So you have to actually either develop a way of ensuring that they're doing things the way that you want it to do, or you have to have more of your staff. You have to have smaller grants. You have to focus less on spending money, right? You have to have capacity building processes so that organizations that don't necessarily have the capacity to do this work well can build it through accompaniment with you. So it changes the whole nature of the aid game. It means that less money is actually going to the supposedly direct beneficiaries. But in doing it a different way, more money will actually be well spent.
So I think inherent in that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Suzanna, but is that also it requires, back to your first point, listening to what the local actors are saying is critical for this, and the way to respond to these things and how you get engagement. Bridget, both the LEV's-L Act and the Global Fragility Act include requirements that local civil society be engaged with. That's a wonderful thing to write in, but how do you actually do that? Like, how on the ground do you get people to approach the US government, which has a whole bunch of hangups and a whole bunch of issues in local populations' minds for a lot of very earned reasons, and say, hey, we're worried about how government is acting in this, or they're not paying attention to this region. And it can be as simple as, access to farming supplies, or it can be there's radio broadcasts going out othering an entire population. How do you get people to engage with these actors, whether they be the subcontractors or the actual USAID employees, and what role does civil society play in that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of flip it the other way, because I think the two big words are trust and power. So I think it's not just about, how do we help USAID and the embassies have the capacities that they need so they have enough staff. It's actually, there is a fundamental trust, a broken trust between local populations and international donors. And that, there's a colonialism, racism history behind this. So, and there's an expertise, the assumption is that the outsiders have the expertise. And so, and there's a power dynamic that's involved. So there's a lot of layers of trying to unpack these relationships and figuring out how can external governments, multilaterals, international NGOs that want to help and want to support prevention of violence and want to support peace building, how can they unpack these layers of lack of trust and legacies of and blatant racism and colonialism that still exists? So I don't have the perfect answer for that, but I think that what we've learned as Peace Direct has tried to figure out how do we do this, and we've been around for about 15 years trying to figure out how to partner with local groups and do it in a different way. We've learned that actually less of our presence as internationals is better often, and more trust and less of us taking up space. Now, we're not a government, so there are other reasons that embassies need to be staffed, and that that I would argue for more capacity. I would argue for more capacities for civilian agencies, absolutely. But it's not because they're the development experts and they need to. There are a lot of very capable experts in peace building, democracy, rights, governance in the local populations, and there are really good organizations, and there are organizations that need more support and more strengthening. So we've now shifted towards a model where we're trying to trust and work with like a hub organization, which is probably a stronger organization, has been around longer, maybe knows how to relate to donors, and they are empowered to then do the small grants out to many more smaller groups and help them capacity build. And that is a way of trying to shift the power away from us holding all the power and say, okay, let's trust this local, strong organization, have them meet a certain level of requirements, but let them also hold power and distribute funds more. So there are ways that USAID has done this, and other have done this as well. So it's not impossible, even within the procurement, and there's laws and structures that we have. But you have to be willing to kind of push the boundaries and take risks in a different way than most people in the system are incentivized to do. They're not incentivized to take risks or push the boundaries. So I think that the local sort of infusion of more funding from the GFA or from the Elie Wiesel is really important, but how it's done is just as important as sort of how much money is written on it. I think I'm sort of echoing some of what Suzanna was saying, but also complicated, I think, with this dilemma of how much, whose job is what and who owns what.
So, Shakriya, to put a pin in this a little bit, because we could talk all night for the rest of it on this part of it, but all of this obviously comes from a presumption of the United States being the actor in the primacy of this. And in this particular situation and in others, the United States has eschewed more multilateral approaches or more international approaches, and specifically gone after a role that puts them as the decision maker on that. Some of that's because of internal funding requirements and rules and regulations about how we do things. Others because that's what we think we have expertise with and how we're going to do things. Is that still the case now as we look at a much more globalized world, as we look at a world with a lot more actors, not just governmental, but non-governmental, who are doing like Peace Direct is doing and serving as a similar kind of provider of development resources and funds? Is this the right role for the U.S. government? Is Elie Wiesel on atrocity prevention and is Global Fragility on trying to increase stability? Should that be a national governmental approach, or should we be operating at more of a multilateral international approach? Mm-hmm. Is the U.S. government actually even the right actor if we are doing national ones? How do we evaluate that?
That's so many questions. I think it's very complicated terrain, and you have to look at individual conflicts and just see what that, like the holistic approach to that specific conflict is. So since the bulk of my experience has been on Afghanistan and peace building, I'll reflect on that. So we've had so many programs. I mean, the CIGAR reports that show back to back how many failures, simply because the policy started in Washington. It was mostly CT, military first. And although we poured a lot of development aid, we never consulted Afghans on the ground first to what are your needs, even when it came to women's rights, where there was consensus both in the Democrat, Republican, both parties really wanted to uplift women, right? But the way the funding in the Promote program went, it's colossal failure. And then, 18, 19 years later, we're handing the country back to the insurgents. And in the peace talks now, we're saying the issue of protecting women is no longer our problem, it's the Afghan government. So this goes to show you how, even after we've had our approach and genuinely wanted to fix things, because we didn't first consult local civil society who already had the answers, because we didn't bring them into the embassy, and there are several activists who could have given you exactly what the needs were across the country, we missed those steps by going in, we're going to save women, and at the end we're handing the women back to the insurgents. Mm-hmm. So these are really the lessons that we have to reflect on, that we really have to flip it. So if you're going into a country, don't design things first. Consult people first. Consult the local organizations or other international organizations that have been active longer than you, have been doing good work. Vet them out, get that going before you go into designing programs, and then the right funding amount that is necessary, not just like, I mean, certain conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, they just, too much money went in. So all we did is, there was a lot of programs that funded the Taliban indirectly. So these are the lessons that I think that this is why global fragility now, right? Because we're saying, look at the root causes of conflict and then develop programming accordingly. And then, consult with local civil society, consult with experts. You do need experts in missions. You can't have, people working only on humanitarian aid or only human rights. You really need conflict experts, peacebuilding experts who then go in and work with local experts to actually design a very holistic approach. And I think that's where you will start to see a shift in actually addressing stability in countries or preventing conflict or atrocities.
So let me pull it a little bit more I realized this after we put this panel together, but the only lawyer on the actual panel, to specifically call out, Nicole, Naomi just came back today from the camps in Bangladesh and gave a
Naomi's my boss.
Oh, sorry, yes. At the Holocaust Museum, the head of the Simon Scott Genocide Prevention Center. One of the things that she brought back was commentary from folks having, lived through and experienced the very emotional high of hearing the ICJ decision be read aloud. For those of you who don't know, the Gambia versus Myanmar decision that came out at the end of the year, just an incredible, recognition of the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya population in Myanmar, the issuance of provisional measures by the International Court of Justice in a very striking, accepting all of the substantive recommendations of the Gambia on this. And then since one of the YYNU, one of the local Rohingya activists who was on the panel this afternoon, mentioned this was all great, but since mid-January, there have been hundreds of killings, targeted shellings of villages, ongoing persecution of the Rohingya population, even despite this. And Naomi brought back and she said, one of the things that we saw was they don't care if it's the ICC or the ICJ or a local tribunal, but they do want to see justice and accountability. And where do we find that? And I'll open this up to each of you, because peacebuilding obviously has accountability as part of that. Peace without accountability is a difficult process, and the world has engaged with this in many different ways: truth and reconciliation commissions, or local chambers, or hybrids, or internationals. This is where we dive into these overlapping elements of fragility and stabilization efforts, but also accountability and atrocity prevention. How do we balance those things as we are also managing all of this other stuff that you guys were talking about, trying to redesign development and engagement and local cooperation and how we identify this? So I expect all of you to solve it.
I mean, it's listening to what Naomi and our other colleagues that went with her heard, the high expectations of what is expected that to mean. And I'm sure I see these parallels across time. I see, all of the promises that were made to the Afghan women. And then I'm thinking that right now, as the U.S. is getting ready to perhaps not extend some kind of protection of civilians mandate in Darfur, that, all the people who we always call IDPs in Darfur, they're genocide survivors and genocide victims who have been just kind of left there since 2005 in the same location they fled to. That these big, lofty endeavors, sometimes the world loses focus after they do them, and then we go on and, I mean, the GFA is not a big, lofty endeavor outside of the United States, but, for the justice, I see justice lost and abandoned along these three issues right now that we're talking about right now this week and last week. And so, I think where the rubber meets the road is actually how do people's lives change on the ground, totally. We have a long way to go. I wanted to pick up on one of the other points that you said is when Bridget was talking about trust. While I do believe that, if when I was in aid, if I could have wrote Peace Direct like a $5 million check every 6 months, I would have done it, right? You know. So, however, that was $5 million of taxpayer money, and Congress wanted to know how it was spent, and everybody wanted to know how it was spent, and they wanted us to count the schools, and they wanted us to count how many women and men were in the program, and all these type of things. But there is a balance between that. There's parts of aid that have tried to do that. I think aid doesn't learn well from non-donor approaches, like if they're NGOs, you know, the people aren't bringing Peace Direct or people who've been funded only by the Gates Foundation or something and saying, how did you guys do it? We don't do that in aid. We don't bring that in and look at other models. We think of ourselves, and I'm saying we because I've only left 8 months ago, but we think of ourselves as leading the donor community. And so that's building that trust and getting out of the embassy. USAID has done it before. You know, I did it in OTI. You actually just sit down. You still have the power because you have the money, but you just say, if you got Washington to buy into the fact that you're going to try to mitigate violence in Darfur, and that's the goal, you're going to let the community tell you how to do it. And if you can have that type of flexibility more, it all fits in the foreign acquisition regulations. Nothing OTI does or things that we give. Yeah. None of those things have ever like broken the law, or you know, we would try not to break the law. But you need to instill that kind of confidence and flexibility also in Congress, who gives us the money and asks for all these reporting requirements, and then listen to people who are able to do it and those models. On the justice piece, I think that's a weak link in the Global Fragility Act. It was one of my kind of overarching concerns because what we have found at the museum, when we had a very smart man who was my boss when Bridget was with me, David Yang. He did a paper for the museum on looking at atrocity prevention fragility. He's now at USIP and still looking at these issues. And he found the same thing that Thomas Carruthers found in the fragility working group, that where these things intersect and where a root issue to address is on the state-society relationship, and if that's ruptured and broken. And to me, that's justice and accountability. All of us have been in places where people are living in a tent and they're talking about, this is what Naomi was hearing, they're talking about justice. Yes, they also want to have clean water, but that, you know, they know, as any thinking human being, that there's something structurally wrong in what they went through and what's happening right now, and it's gotta be these core issues. And so I think that justice, and some of these terms are mentioned in the GFA, but they're not really prioritized. They're not talked about as benchmarks in going into a compact with governments. They talk about having a compact arrangement, but then that you find that means that we're going to try to do that with a government that has inherent fragility because of their bad relationship with their society. So, you know, not prioritizing human rights and justice and accountability. These are all things that I think there's space there to further define. But seeing where USAID prioritizes those issues and seeing these failures across Afghanistan, Darfur, and now Burma. Hopefully not Burma. Maybe there won't be a total failure there of how justice trickles down to the ground level. I worry about that piece a lot. But I'm not a lawyer, so you guys are going to fix that part. So.
Can I just say on building on that, I think also it's how justice trickles up too, right? Because what people want is change in their lives. And people want to define justice for themselves and their own societies. And I think that a lot of the progress over the last few decades with, you know, different types of tribunals, different types of reconciliation process shows that. It demonstrates that there's more space for that, for local communities to define justice themselves. But, you know, this report that we just issued, it's called Radical Flexibility, Strategic Funding in an Age of Local Activism. And it was, the primary author is a woman named Reva Kanowitz. And Reva spent 6 years in state running the transitional justice program, trying to get money down to local communities in conflict and post-conflict places to help them do justice and accountability and reconciliation in the way they wanted to do it. And she still sends out personal emails about groups in Syria that she worked with because she's, you know, cares deeply about what they're doing. But she got completely fed up with the way the system worked. And she's almost given up entirely on government money. She's almost said, this is just, there's so many ways that this is not working that we need to have other ways that we can help get resources to local communities as well. And we need to let them define what they want to do with it. So we work just on the justice piece. We work with a group in South Kivu who has helped stand up local peace courts in about 20 communities. And this is an area that has, talk about fragility, it has no governance. There's no courts that you can go to hardly at all. There's no police. There's a lot of armed guys roaming around and a lot of different militia competing with each other. But there's very little access to justice, formal justice systems. So the local communities bring together leaders from across, a lot of different parts of the community. They deal with disputes, and it's really important because it's preventive, and it's reconciliatory, because any small dispute over land or something else could easily escalate quickly into people pulling in their militias. So they had these peace courts going on, and they had women's courts separately because the women said, we don't want to take our issues to this mix of group, including these men leaders. We want women-only courts. So they have women. So they innovated and said, we want women courts. Okay, great. Here's some more money. Let's raise some more money, flexible money for you to do women's courts. There was a massacre in one of the villages, and they were really devastated because they said, this is a village with a court. This had a peace court. We failed. And then they said, you know what we need a super court. We need a representative from all the peace courts around these communities to function as a super court to deal with intercommunal violence, which is what this was. It wasn't an internal dispute in the community. It was an external attack. So then they've started innovating to try to do it. So I think justice, it's also, it evolves, right? And communities have to
building an actual justice system from scratch in the absence of a government's capacity to do so.
Yeah, and do they still want top dogs in Kinshasa to be held accountable? Yes. Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. But in the meantime, what can they do in their community to bring some sense of justice?
When you mentioned the justice up, when I was first starting out in international law, one of the primary examples, and it took a long time and it had mixed results, but the international community in Rwanda spent a long time trying to figure out how to engage on justice on the scale in question, because everyone knew that the ICTR could simply not engage with every actor, and yet these were neighbors that were going back home. And so there was the eventual acceptance, and it was, I've heard people on the inside talk about this, it was a very hard fight to get Katachi Trials, which are trials is not the Katachi proceedings, accepted by the UN as a recognized, to be able to hand back captured individuals to local communities to go through this proceeding, which was reconciliatory, which was recompensatory, convictions would require working on someone's farm for X amount of days out of the week because their husband or son had been killed, and so now you had an inability to maintain. And there was also the element, I forget what the exact statistic was, but it was more than half of the surviving men in Rwanda would have been put in jail if you had put everyone in jail for doing this. So justice up from this, but boy, did the international community fight against that as long as they possibly could before they finally kind of bowed to, and I don't think it was that they realized that they were wrong about accepting.
They didn't have an alternative.
They didn't have an alternative. Yeah. There was no way to do it, and they needed something, quite frankly, to be able to point to and said, justice is happening, and some voices were very strong saying, how about you let them figure out what justice means in this context?
And just a really quick point that was really stark to me when I was working in Darfur. We thought we had a flexible mechanism. I was there for OTI, and I was given a lot of leeway to just sit and listen and see what people wanted. Office of Transition Initiatives. I thought I said it earlier. Sorry, Office of Transition Initiatives. And they will, like Suzanna was saying, you need people. But this is two things that were different. We were allowed to live in Darfur as a U.S. government officer, so that doesn't happen very often at all anymore. And secondly, we had the flexibility to. I had, as the country rep, to spend $150,000 on a given day, and I didn't have to get Washington approval. I'd explain what I was trying to do, but I didn't. I could do different things as the way to get to the goal. And so when we were talking about justice and that, as atrocities were still unfolding, there were certain areas we were able to work in. UNDP, UN Development Program, had rule of law officers starting to come out there in the middle of a conflict, also very innovative and not usually done by UNDP. So many women's focus groups that we would have say, if you want to make this right, you pay the blood dia. And I sat there just kind of thinking, like, how would we write these grants? You know? Like,
blood dia.
Yes.
Line item,
Hey,
blood dia.
justice served, you know? And that really was the overwhelming call. And, you know, DC was like, that's just gonna, you know, that's just not what we can do. And a few women said, and I said, what we can do is do a local, we can support you to pursue a local case in a local court. And we did pursue a local rape case in the court in El Janaina. It was the first one during that time. And it started to bring recognition that rape was not just something that the government said was just not happening or was something that was criminal, that it was starting to pull out the nature of rape as a weapon of the genocide. So I thought, like, oh, I can't be as flexible and I can't do what the people want. But actually, and we're finding this now in the Holocaust Museum's work, that we have funding to do justice work in South Sudan and Burma, funded by a private funder, so we can do what we want. Yay, that's why I left government.
Yep.
Is that nobody wants the same thing, you know? Like, there were women in Darfur who wanted to try to make the courthouse that they saw work. Very few. Most of them wanted the blood dia. But, like, nothing's monolithic. And, you know, everybody's just human. And how they define justice and what they want for redress and reparations, always it looks a little different. And it's extremely hard with U.S. government money to be that flexible, right? But the U.S. government could probably be better in saying, we're not going to be able to do this. Who else can do this? And bring in partners.
I'll jump in on that point and go back to your earlier question, because I think now it would make more sense answering it. But, like, really looking at the question of, is U.S. an honest broker when it comes to justice? So, like, when we're engaged in these endless wars, we have put in actors in government in power that have been, you know, previously accused of mass atrocities, war crimes. In Afghanistan, we have a vice president currently that Amnesty International has documentation for killing 50,000 people during the Civil War. So these are the actors we've empowered. So why is it that an insurgency continues, right? Then are we the honest broker to go in and say, well, there was a case at the ICC on Afghanistan. We shut it down. Why? Because we watched a lot of that stuff. We've empowered a lot of people who have done a lot of those things. So in certain conflicts now, depending on which conflicts get picked when we're implementing the Global Fragility Act, we may not be the best people going in saying this is what you need to do. We may have to work with other allies that don't have that same reputation and have acted differently, and then collaborate and maybe channel money through them to go do this work. Because we really have to be honest with ourselves. How have we played a role in creating these situations? And in certain conflicts, we don't have that, we're not the neutral party. So we need to leave certain things to other allies or international mechanisms. And the other thing is, we're not a signatory to the ICC. So it's always difficult as advocate to go in another country and talk about why someone else needs to be pulled, but we can't talk. You know, I always get that on the other end, like, well, who are you to talk? Right? So this is, I think, for advocates in this room, something we have to also hold our own government accountable. And when are we going to meet those international standards that we impose on everybody else?
I will flag that the U.S. government wishes it could just shoot down a prosecution at the ICC. It was not the U.S. government that did so. It was the chambers there. But they certainly expressed their strong opposition to it, I think, and perhaps had an influence in that sense. I was going to. Yeah. Go right ahead.
So I say this is why your book on donors.
Right, exactly. I know. That's what I'm like. So first of all, the U.S. government is in no way, shape, or form the model actor in this space, right? The U.S. government is known as being very rigid, disconnected, stuck in its compound, except for maybe the OTIs and a few people get out, and trying to go it alone when everybody else is coordinating and engaging and actually making things happen. All donors in this space are confused because this is extremely difficult work, and the modalities and instruments that donors disposal are limited and not suited. So if you want to change it, then you need more funding for things like the GFA. You need more funding for transitional programming. Pure development aid, pure humanitarian aid are not suited. You need to change the funding structure. That's the only way you change the way that implementation happens. That's my first point. Second point, what Peace Direct is doing should not be radical.
It should be common sense.
It should be common sense. I mean, if you talk to old development hands, I mean, this is what you do. The idea that you could know, I mean, I worked in Burundi during the war, right? The idea that I could have known in any way, shape, or form what was the appropriate solution for Burundi at that point in time was craziness, right? So I think that this should not be radical. This is the only way you're actually likely to get good results, period. And that needs to reshape the thinking. Third, I want to say that, I don't see a kind of division between justice and peace here. And I kind of want to push this a little bit. And this comes from, in the 90s, I worked at the Council on Foreign Relations for the Center for Preventative Action during the time of the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict. So when a lot of these ideas were coming up, and people kind of dreamed that they could somehow prevent violence worldwide. I'll leave it there. But what I learned a lot there is kind of that, so much of prevention and so much of this approach is about changing the status quo. Atrocity prevention is a quicker, more urgent, more robust change, right? Conflict prevention, preventing violent extremism is about the long game. Ideally, if you do the conflict prevention, preventing violent extremism right, then you're not going to end up in the place of atrocity prevention. But from a bureaucratic perspective, they kick different actors into play, right? And the atrocity prevention requires many more resources and political and military and high level, sanction-based action often in a way that conflict prevention doesn't. So I think that it's important to realize that these are a spectrum but for the organization, the atrocity prevention is much, much more difficult. And sometimes yet, it's more interesting, you really want to work on it, right? But maybe part of this is about putting the lens of the urgency of atrocity prevention into the conflict prevention space. And that's how you actually make a difference. I want to say that, the reason why I don't see the kind of justice peace division is because programmatically they're all together, right? So if you're working in Burundi on kind of reintegration, you're dealing with land rights, you're dealing with courts, you're dealing with all of the things that like the whole child, I worked for UNICEF, or the whole family has to experience. And so part of the problem is the bureaucratic silos and the bureaucratic interests that actually try to engage, which segment out the different sets of needs. So I think, just from observing this conversation, part of actually making the LOSL Act and the GFA speak to each other is trying to break down some of the bureaucratic barriers that exist between the different acts, the different groups promoting them, and saying, what does this mean on the ground for this individual or for that group? And then that helps you see how you can actually create some of what I call bottom-up coherence, but the idea that you actually create something from the bottom up where you're getting direction about how you should work, not from your top-down different expertise and perspectives, but from what this actually means from the field. I'll stop here.
Okay. I want to leave some time for questions from the audience. Allie, I'm going to press you into service to take the mic around. Not to ask a question.
She looks like she has a great question. I heard.
Allie's a former intern, so I'm going to.
Thank you. Hi. So I wanted to go a little deeper on the justice issue because, in fact, I do agree with the thing that you said, that justice and peace are not the opposite. And I'm from Colombia, so we had this debate very, very extensively during the peace accords. And I remember in one of the debates that was in the Constitutional Court, somebody said the antonym of war is not peace, it's justice. And that's really what is going to get us there. And so, and specifically in the case of Colombia, something happened that I think was very important also as a measure of the peace accords, and is that the U.S. intervened through the justice system. So the U.S. Asked for the extradition of this former guerrilla member, Jesus Santrich, for still dealing drugs after the peace accords. And this was very important in the country because it kind of measured the true implementation and which part of the guerrillas were actually doing peace and which were not. And this is something we're still struggling with. And in the end, well, the extradition didn't happen, but this person actually went back to the guerrilla and sort of like said, we are going back to war. So this is I find something a very important tool that the U.S. has, and is to actually prosecute when our governments, our justice systems are not working. And in the case of Colombia, it's very easy because of the drug problem, so it can be attached in a very kind of simple way with the U.S. But I wanted to ask, what is the possibility of actually prosecuting for international crimes in the U.S. under the universal jurisdiction principle as a way to prevent atrocities?
Oh, everyone's looking.
That's really the international lawyer.
Yes. I know.
So there's a really great example of this right now that's trying to be attempted by individuals from Myanmar who are prosecuting in Argentina under the universal jurisdiction principle. This is something that is fascinating because literally when I was in law school and was starting on this was pie in the sky. People thought this is a joke. You talked about universal jurisdiction because technically it was an example of a type of jurisdiction, and then the law professor almost immediately said, and this doesn't actually exist except for piracy. And so the idea that genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes would actually rise to that level is significant. It's faced a lot of challenges. There's an ICJ decision, the arrest warrants case, that's specifically about Belgium trying to do this pre-ICC actually coming into effect, and the International Court basically shooting them down and saying immunities actually still apply. That was because it was a government actor. Obviously, militia groups raise a different, and one of the things in the post 9/11 world we have to deal with is non-state actors who exercise the equivalent of state authority and power, but don't actually have the traditional immunities that we would subscribe to under pure international law. So there's a lot of really interesting developments in this. From the US's perspective, unfortunately, there's very limited jurisdiction for us domestically to do this, which is why we mostly prosecute individuals under other metrics. Now, Kristen, check me if I get the name wrong. The Human Rights Unit, the International Human Rights Unit at the FBI and the Department of Justice. Human Rights and Special Prosecutions, there we go. So there's two units that the US government has, but they're focused on finding people who are within the United States. So they are built around a unfortunate historical past, which is that politically, sometimes America has let perpetrators of grave and serious breaches of human rights into the country for politically expedient means. Thankfully, when that political will evaporates to protect them, often there is this office that is there to prosecute, at the very least to remove, and occasionally to prosecute.
Yeah, it's almost 90% of the time removal because they did not admit to torture or grave human rights abuses,
which are the only things that we
their
have.
Immigration.
Yes.
So their immigration status is revoked and they're removed.
Yeah.
And it's a joint unit with FBI and DHS.
Yeah.
They're co-joined. It's neat because it's across two different departments.
And there was an attempt to defund them significantly last year that kicked up a lot of fuss, and they actually still exist.
Yes.
As does the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the State Department, thankfully as well. I wouldn't want to speculate on what the future looks like, because 10 years ago I'd have told you that universal jurisdiction wasn't a real thing that was applied. So, obviously there's room for growth and change on this issue. There is also, it's worth noting, in again a purely international law perspective, there is the International Law Commission has put out a call for a treaty on a crimes against humanity document. There is not a treaty on crimes against humanity right now. There is a gap in the law on this. And the goal of it is not to create another international tribunal or another international body. The goal is to create a requirement that when states sign on, they actually have domestic legislation that requires prosecution for individuals of persecution of crimes against humanity, including individuals that are in their territory but may not be their citizens for those crimes. That's a huge deal. That's a big thing. And if we can get to that point, the UN General Assembly, usually when they don't like something, they kick it down the can and they say, like, in 5 years, come back and tell us about it again, and then it dies. Last year, they said, report on this again next year, having talked to states again, which is an unusual step for them. And they haven't ever actually done that with one of the International Law Commission's things. So we think that that means that they actually like it and they just are worried about the politics between the states. Maybe that will result in a treaty process coming out. Multilateral treaties are more rare right now, but it's interesting. I wish I had more positive notes about universal jurisdiction within the US, but I don't.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline. I work with the Stimson Center. I have two questions. One is a little simpler than the others. One is than the other. I just wanted to hear if anyone has any insights into how the LEOISL Act, but more recently, the GFA has been received by the DoD. It seems to re-envision it doesn't seem like it has no implications for them, but to re-envision in the same way that the SAR does, the Stabilization Assistance Review, more of a support role and less of a leading role in some of these contexts. Is that how they are seeing it? And, everyone's out of government now, so you may not know the answer to that. My second question is about risk tolerance. Does the U.S. government I feel like this has been touched on a lot here from that, we're no longer allowed to live in Darfur, like literal security risk tolerance to tolerance for risk in engaging with local stakeholders that are beyond what our institutions trust, to the tolerance for funding to be flexible, that we are not willing to risk dollars being used in innovative, we're not willing to take on the financial risk that innovation requires in this space. Do you think that that the U.S. government, both the administration and Congress, has the risk tolerance it needs to implement this legislation effectively? And if not, how can we increase their tolerance for risk in this space?
Well, I don't know if I can answer the questions well, but I think part of it is that on the DoD question, I think that there are a lot of people in DoD who welcome these bills because they're tired of being sent on missions that they can't fulfill. And they're tired of civilian agencies of the lack of coordination and lack of sort of comprehensive strategies. But for risk, no. The flat answer is no, the U.S. doesn't have the risk tolerance that's needed. But if you look at what DoD does and the level of risk DoD takes, that maybe there's a lot to learn from there. And having DoD more engaged in the GFA process and in the LEOISL process, I think we'd all be better off if there was more DoD engagement than civilian agencies trying to you can't, this is the biggest, as Nicole said, this is the biggest player in the room. It's the player who can get out and risk more. It's the player who has more resources. And if you look at thinking about a comprehensive strategy to reduce conflict and you're not engaging DoD in what it's doing, it doesn't make any sense, for good and for ill. We're looking at, what are the impacts of all engagements in a country. So I think that the answer is more coordination and more engagement with DoD, and I would hope that there would be more, DoD would welcome that. I don't really know practically right now how they're responding to GFA.
I haven't heard.
So I think it's too early to respond on GFA, but I can say on the LEOISL Act, we've had consultations with DoD in the room and given recommendations. I mean, part of the trouble, and Wes knows this very well, is we don't even have a list of countries that is being prioritized by the U.S. government on atrocities prevention. Even though LEOISL has passed, we're hoping we'll get that on the second report, but it wasn't given to us. On the first report, so we've been working on the Hill, there's been a letter sent to the administration, particularly to Secretary Pompeo, to prioritize and let us know which countries you are working on to prevent atrocities. So not having that, it's hard to see, okay, how is the DoD involved in that country and how can it be leveraged to do something on atrocity prevention? So I think that's the thing we're pushing on now. Once you have that, then you can sort of make recommendations. but we're still on the early phases of implementation, even though it's been a year, where it's like a slow process. And Global Fragility Act just passed, so I think it remains to be seen. We have our first AP consultation coming up this Thursday, and there's going to be a round of consultations with many civil society organizations. So yeah, I think
I mean, I think there's also a problem with the way Congress, these laws were done without complete DOD put in there, because then you create a whole nother congressional process, right? With other committees, and it's really complicated. But actually, that's part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
No the congressional committees for foreign affairs are different from DOD, and yet we're talking about security issues that should be looked at comprehensively. And the relationships between DOD and their committees and the civilian agencies and their committees are radically different. I mean, in terms of what you have to answer to, the DOD doesn't have to prove their strategies are working, and the relationships with the committees are very strong. The committees see themselves as like, this is our agency. This is who we're here to support. We're going to provide oversight, but there's a really sort of positive relationship there. Good or bad.
Which goes to your point of risk tolerance.
Right. And the civilian agencies don't want to talk to Congress. They're scared to death of Congress.
Yeah, but it goes to, DOD has the most amount of detailees on the Hill than any other federal department or agency. And I remember USAID struggling to put like 2 people on the Hill. They don't get asked. When I was in the National Security Council's Africa Directorate, and I asked DOD as an advisor to the White House, how big is your footprint in AFRICOM? And they were like, you silly girl, we don't ask those questions. We don't need to know that. Well, eventually they did when U.S. soldiers kept dying in Somalia and Niger. But they never get called to task on these big things. But there's this inherent trust and a high risk tolerance, and frankly, not a lot of accountability on the largest defense budget that's been passed.
They can't pass an audit.
Right. And DOD officers will say, we do not need all this money when you talk to them individually. I think the other thing too on your risk tolerance question is, I've never seen, unfortunately there's a lot of reports of things that have gone badly, either by USAID or development or strategies, but I've not seen that report after 9/11 or after Benghazi that says, here are examples that when we got out of the embassy, when we did these things, and it's not just Office of Transition Initiatives, or like when another entity did it and we did it in partnership, or when we decided to work with DFID in Bangladesh and we partnered with another donor. I haven't seen that report, come from anywhere, either internally inside the U.S. government, to start to erode this risk aversion. It's heartbreaking because, as Suzanna said, any old school development actor is going to say that's how you do development. That's why they came to this field, right? Not to sit behind an embassy wall in an office that looks like they're back in DC, to be out. And so, and that happened in my professional lifetime, just being out all the time and then all of a sudden being just inside all the time. And it's just terrible. And how we reverse that trend, I think we have to have really solid, good examples somehow to push that level of risk and tolerance up, show them it works, show them it can be done, and that the Secretary of State won't sit in a 24-hour hearing called to task over Benghazi because she made bad decisions. Show them how to do it. And I think you're right, without militarizing fragility and stability more, I think we can learn from some lessons in DOD, but keep it in the civilian sphere. Yeah.
So, excellent question. I agree with everything. I want to think from a organizational perspective, the way that you actually do something like this is you pilot and protect, right? That you say, if the GFA is going to work, it is going to actually enable people to have a high risk tolerance. Anybody doing this can have a high risk tolerance. Hey, we can look over at DOD to see what a high risk tolerance looks like. But you can actually take these examples and create examples, take existing examples and create new examples and say the GFA and the focus countries are essentially our chance to protect and pilot, right? And to focus on trying the things that we know that they work well because lots of other actors are doing them. The US government used to do them in the past, right? And we actually know how to do them, and we're going to instill them. Then we're going to gather evidence and data that this is what works well, which can actually help to catalyze larger change. But that's how companies do it. That's how any organization kind of shifts a culture in a particular way. I just want to say, I think the risk tolerance question is fascinating from a DoD perspective, because when you said that, Bridget, you said it, right? That you need to bring DoD more into the picture. And I was like, yes, because military, anybody who's in the military knows Clausewitz, right? Clausewitz is all about the fog of war, that you don't know what's going to happen. You have to adapt. You have to figure out what's going on. All plans are lost. The military trains and prepares for that. That's its MO, right? And so if you say, we have a fog of peace too, or we have a fog of neither
transition.
Right, exactly. The fog of transition.
Yeah.
There is high risk. It's a different type of risk, but you need different tools, different training, different type of unit cohesion. All of the things that DoD employs to deal with the fog of war, there are different solutions in these contexts. And kind of outlining that, and in some ways speaking DoD's language may be one way to actually help them understand what this means.
I would say, though, that DoD officers in the embassy would be like, you're just going to go out there dressed like that? And I would be like, yes. Right. So in some ways, I felt like we were a lot more tolerant than they were, because they were so used to being armed everywhere they went.
Yeah.
But I totally agree, Susanna. Those are very helpful.
In my grad degree, we had a drinking Gatorade every time we did the class.
Oh, excellent. Well, no reception yet. Yeah.
So we do need to wrap things up, but I want to thank our wonderful panel for a very engaging discussion and wide-ranging, and we could have spent several more hours going over all of this, but I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.